My name is Summer, and this video is called The Human Collective Trauma Wave. In this video, I want to talk about my perspective of what I see humanity as living in. Humanity, essentially, from my perspective, is living in a state of unconscious negativity. That the true state of humanity, naturally speaking, is to be like Christ, naturally. And what we see around us is almost like a collapsed version of what we were originally intended to be. Something happened to the species, something that created such an intensely powerful trauma that it's literally being pushed like a wave through the generations, from generation to generation to generation. And everybody who encounters that trauma wave is unable to really hold enough of their own center to be able to counteract the influences of that wave. Maybe this happened in stages. Maybe it was only like a seed in the very beginning, but over time that trauma wave has pushed through all of us and has created a warping in our perspectives, in our lifestyles, in our behaviors, in our interactions with one another. Because this trauma wave exists somewhere inside of all of us in terms of humanity, part of the effect seems to be that we start retracting and polarizing ourselves in a state of injury. Almost in a sense, if you imagine a world disaster taking place, something like 9/11, for example, such a shocking thing happens, then the American people, for example, they militarize and they become instantly catalyzed in a state of protection, almost like your immune system stepping up to protect you from an illness that it's trying to protect itself from suffering. And because we're still living in such an enormous state of trauma, we're actually just constantly militarized in terms of what our natural expression is as people. So this will go into very inhuman, very unemotional, very unempathic experiences and feelings that each of us have and become institutionalized in terms of society. It's because of that separation from ourselves, because we're kind of creating a kind of fight, a protection sort of experience all across the planet. Everyone is just constantly reinforcing in all the ways that we create our shields the kind of fear or the kind of trauma that we're still suffering as a species from whatever is happening and has happened in the past. Okay, Sarah says that it comes from the Anunnaki primarily. There are other influences, but we're not getting into that right this video. During those times, in Lemuria, preceding Atlantis, that inversion, that trauma wave or whatnot was in the seed kind of form. So, right. So what I'm saying essentially is that wave over time seems to have gotten worse in the collective of humanity. And what's happening is that that seed has grown so far, it's now sophisticating itself out of its own humanity. It's taking over in a sense. It's like humanity was knocked into a concussion, and then it's partially awake and very, very much so, very much asleep. And in that sleepiness, it puts things into there like technology that are not reflections of any kind of natural connection with itself. But it also goes into the behavior of people, in terms of how we treat each other, in terms of how your parents raised you. I will contradict myself a little bit. In certain levels, there seems to be more connection with certain people, but there's also this sliver of something a little bit frightening inside all of that. It's almost like doing that just to professionalize itself, in a sense. It's almost like every time some good revelation happens, the negativity just catalyzes even stronger in humanity. And then it starts to develop itself in that like almost like militaristic warlike mentality. And I find that more and more and more, the things that are applauded in society in terms of like success seem to be things that embody a very narcissistic, like psychopathic kind of mentality. And I would say that that in fact is the true state of being of humanity. Now, if you take account what I said earlier in the video, that our nature inherently is to be Christ. We're supposed to be Christ. That's like our regular like 50%, like just basically being what we are Christ. The 51% positive that people are referring to in terms of ascension is when you are a Christ, when you express that you are a Christ in terms of your expression. But we are not like that. All of us are living reverse and treating Christ as if it's like some high success achievement, and that's not what it is. For us to be in this state of constant like stress and problems, like turn on the evening news, it's like such a disaster on this planet, right? If you were to like run a business, for example, that had that amount of trouble in it, you would have to conclude this is not a successful venture, right? Like, I mean, like, you just have to recognize that about humanity in a sense. It's like, it is not a successful venture. We are like in extreme issues. And the strong points of us in society talk about their successes within that, but it's not taken from a holistic standpoint. It's not a solution that works for everybody. It tries to kind of like, in a sense, beat other people up to try to be as whatever arbitrary strength that they lucked out, in a sense, into having for their life in a state of total disaster around it. And not to say that all strong points, like the positive people, the real successes, are like entirely failures who are not holistic, because there is still the idea of people who are that balanced, that integrated and holistic, but even them are used in a sense to like beat people up, to like be like they are, when the whole point is that's not it at all. The point is to validate the individual uniqueness of each and every single person for being something that is priceless and irreplaceable. Doesn't matter how negative they are, doesn't matter how evil they are or what they've done or whatnot. It doesn't matter, because everybody's here, like in a sense, like parts of your body exist. They're there for a reason. It's not just junk DNA. It has a purpose. It didn't create that stuff to just be lying there to do nothing. It has a reason for being there, and it has to do with the finer things in life, the things we would define as being divine, because they're so beyond our regular, ordinary human experience that we view them as being better than us, when it's in fact our natural state of being. It's every single person's natural state of being to be like a divine child in a playground that is heaven-like on earth. It was, in a sense, Sarah is saying, to some extent, but because of that poisoning from earlier species, it basically carried across time until eventually, well, I'm going to get into that in a later video. That trauma wave is so powerful. It's so enormous. You can, like, your psychology does not have the cohesion it needs to maintain itself when it interacts with that. And you collapse, you polarize yourself in your own particular style and become, without recognizing, against yourself. This is the idea of what people term the ego. But the ego isn't negative. The ego is positive. That's like saying your body is negative because it creates illnesses or something like that. So we just have to cut the body off and then there's no more illnesses. That makes sense, right? But that's part of our psychopathy, right? It's like we'll endorse thinking of behaviors like that because we're in that state of like craziness and we don't actually recognize like how we were supposed to be. In machine standards, it's like when the machine is humming. It's when you know it's built and operating according to its parameters for construction. Like that, The humming, the proper correct functioning is like beauty, bliss, and love, love and light. That's just the machine's nature for how it was designed to express itself and function and flow naturally and effortlessly without injury or without suffering of any kind whatsoever at all in any kind of history past. It's not some part of some natural growth or something like that. It's because of something injured somewhere, some kind of thing that has corrupted the natural expression such as it was meant to exist. Society breaks you in the most intimate ways. It breaks you to be anti-human in a societal structure that is acting like it's human, when in fact it's only representing a humanity that has been kind of like shelled in its appearance, covering up the true distortion that we each contain inside all of us, the corruption that we've taken that is so powerful we're even unconscious that it even exists. It's normal, yes, but it's not natural, and it's not part of the human design. It was never intended to be like that on any kind of natural level whatsoever, including the animals, who I would imagine to have become predacious because of the manner we express ourselves, and because they're at usually second density and third density. Maybe some are fourth and fifth as well, but because of the predominance of the human energy on the planet and the profundity of that trauma expression, they're all affected and they follow suit. Just like you would if you were in a gang of people who were like intensely rageful and angry. At a certain point, your mental stability would crack, and then it would be nurtured by a negative mindset. It's almost like an empath cracking under like a narcissist's like dominance to be narcissistic. Maybe the empath comes out as like a weird narcissist, but the empath starts to take on the characteristics, the behavior of the narcissistic mentality that doesn't recognize itself as narcissistic. And in this case, I would say on a human level, generally psychopathic, which is why we contain within the overall oneness of the human race the idea of psychopaths. They're not separate from us. They are at one with how we all are generally. They're just that side of it. That's just that breaking at that point for whatever reason to be that expression of it. But it literally grows, fosters, and is nurtured by all the negative psychopathic mentalities that surround it. It's constantly reinforced by all of us, not recognizing how separated we are from ourselves. I know that kind of sounds like putting like an enormous responsibility on the human race. You better Christ up or otherwise it's all your fault. But I don't mean it in that sense, because the Christ mentality would always be accepting and loving. The Christ mentality takes its whole resource from unconditional self-respect and love for itself. That, if you can do that to yourself, is what instantly translates and dismantles the wars that you see around you. Within yourself, the war in your own life can end by falling in love with yourself. I think even Bashar said this too, that dreams are the only place that you will ever find the resolution to the conflicts we have in our life stories. That is the end of the war within inside ourselves, the splitting of ourselves between unconscious, how we are conscious differently in dreams, and conscious separated from that consciousness in third density physical reality. The only person who has the capacity to give you the most love in your life is yourself. Nobody can actually do that for you but yourself. So the idea of someone sacrificing themselves for you is like, it's a non sequitur, because physics says it doesn't actually work that way. The only thing they can do is provide you assistance to save yourself. Just like a doctor, the doctor never cures anything. They're only being in assistance to people to help them cure themselves. That's all that's really occurring in all interactions with everyone. So what you want is to turn on your fountain of joy, love, and happiness and be the center of that. And then you will see in all aspects of your life, it will start to shift how you experience your experience of life. But really, you love life. Just like you have like a favorite color, a favorite food or something, it's particular to you. It's not, nobody can save you. Like, it's your particular desire to be in love with life in the manner in which you've built yourself to be here. Everything is completely fingerprint different for every single person on the in the whole family of humanity. But when we sacrifice ourselves, it's like we make ourselves less of who we are to ourselves, and then we end up having to depend on people who are less of themselves in the world. And this happens in every single relationship we have, whether it's the most intimate relationship or the most like acquaintance relationship that you might have, or professional kind of like interaction you have with a person outside, or stranger relationship, however you want to see it, the most distant from like an intimate. So in the most intimate relationships, in terms of like relationships, it's almost like two half people get together to kind of represent what it's supposed to be as a whole. But then as those people start to celebrate and relax, they end up like pushing against themselves, because now they have this space and they have what they need to like actually grow into themselves. So you see this in relationships all the time. The people who are like close together, they'll end up pushing each other apart, or they'll end up growing into each other in this kind of sick way. And then we have to create the idea of like what's called boundaries, right? So it's like, well, I have this form, so I need to create a boundary like this or something, so that we can coexist together, because we're each not fully developed, and we're not going to be, most of us, by the end of our lives. So we have to create this like idea. But that's what's going on, because we're not fully embracing ourselves, we're not fully in our lives. So you don't see the kind of like success and the potential and the abilities that each and every one of us can have that would seem psychic or supernatural in so many senses, and they're not. They're absolutely natural. They're human. They're very, very human. I have this saying in terms of referring to like Christ as like sort of like superheroes, and it's like you see them like superhumans, right? But the idea really is that each and every one of those, they're not just superhumans, they're superhuman, which means they laugh harder, they cry harder, they suffer more deeply, but their experience is so much more expansive. They're so much more vulnerable, but then they're so much more strong because of it. And they breathe and live so much deeper. And that just means expanding into your like higher self, into more of who you are, more of life's capability to like be who you are. That's where we're going. If you're watching this video, you're on that path. You are the birth of Christ consciousness coming back into the story, the birth of healthiness coming back. You're like the first healthy breath within yourself of new and beautiful and colorful emotions that the world hasn't yet seen. It has no definition or context or category for who you are, because it's so uniquely special and beautiful. But since the principle in humanity is psychopathic, which means it's almost like some rabid, ravenous dog or something like that that has become like locked into a state of like extreme violence or extreme predation, just going around attacking and murdering everything. It's sort of like that has existed for long enough for it to like cool off and sophisticate and professionalize itself, so it can go around murdering things just casually, right? It's just sort of how it is. We have developed a kind of civility. It's almost like the idea of like organized crime, right? Which people used to say back in the day couldn't possibly have existed. There can't be any such thing as the mafia. It can't, because we would have known about that. But here they are, a very organized, gentlemanly, professional group of murderers and psychopaths who are absolutely criminal in all senses. It's like, how do you not know that that isn't what humanity in general has become? Like, would you ever ask yourself that question? Like, are there parts of me that are that ravenous and I can't see because I have no context? And if that context were to show up, for example, in the form of extraterrestrial life, would I just encounter things about myself that Summer's telling me? in my state of projectedness, in my state of separation from really being who I am, I would project my state of being on the person who was being the mirror. And I would take a stone and smash the mirror, right? I would hate them. I would reject them. I would fight them. You messed up my world. You messed up my life, right? I think if there are people watching this video who at all connect to this, you probably had that finger pointed in your face a little bit here and there. You've taken it on yourself too, because you had to in certain senses to survive. But that's what's literally occurring in the outside. This trauma wave, this polarization of human people, of their beautiful, natural, empathic, holistic selves that are like untouched, like largely in infancy, but are being nurtured by this black, cancerous kind of like expression of humanity that is very, very polarized against itself. The system is built in a state of mental trauma, like such extreme trauma that every single system, no matter how good or altruistic it might be in its intention to be created, it's built in an unconscious framework mentality that is largely polarized against its natural form and has no history contextually to actually define itself as negative. It has no current reminders that exist left in the human experience that show anything like that. Here and there, you might get certain reminders from people you call like geniuses or savants or things like that, some level of it. But you also get similar kind of reminders from people who are psychopaths, because the kind of level and extent and drive that they have to like commit the crimes they do expresses, at least negatively, a kind of integrity that most people do not contain at like the regular level. Our mentality is polarized in such a sense that we applaud the strongest of us, because strongest is like safest, and we're all in a state of danger unto ourselves because we're in that trauma, that collective trauma wave. So we applaud people who express higher level understandings, but almost like capped or bent in like a negative framework. So it's like they'll have the concepts of things that are incredibly beautiful, like incredibly Christ-like, but then they're still doing it in a negative capacity. And so it becomes like the symbol once again that we're not seeing, because we still value those people who are like leaders in our world as being the height of what humanity is, when in many senses it could be like the symbol of everything that's wrong with us. In terms of the people though, who rise within humanity to be positive, they do and have existed in the past within the system. But largely when the system starts to become self-aware, when the darker, more unconscious levels of humanity become aware of what those people are actually using to be positively, it instantly gets re-identified from the negative concept. And those people who are expressing what humans could be in a more positive sense, like I'm talking about people who are like really positive contributions, they can get as far as the system cannot recognize them existing. But once the system becomes more sophisticated and more aware, like naturally, but negatively, it starts to identify those people as errors. And then you'll see this idea, and I've seen it so many times too, where you have people almost like selling out, if you know what I mean, like musicians or artists or whatever. But even to all of us, it's like the point or the priority, you know, what's most important is being replaced by something that is less important to look at. This falls in line with like all the ideas of like being politically correct and things like that. It's like a means to try to clean things up, to help people, but can also be shackling to things that are more necessary than manners, for example. Like true justice, if it hasn't been there, will come out raw and angry. and it needs to be heard for what it is, regardless of what kind of vitriol hatred it might be spitting out all over the place. It's necessary. It's necessary for us to have these conversations, to bring light to this and to have awareness of it. A lot of the times people who have that positivity will be like either self-corrected by the knowledge that humanity is passing around in a state of kind of like drunken unconsciousness, in a state of like trauma, where it does contain a certain level of understanding of what positivity is and what community is and things like that, and will try its best effort, best intention to try to correct things positively, but it's still in a state of darkness. So we'll recognize, especially it will recognize the new children that are being born right now as being errors, when in fact they are not. They represent the physical integrity that doesn't exist in the majority yet, because it hasn't been created. So those children primarily is who I make these videos for. And if you're watching it or interested, you probably have these children, or you probably are one yourself. I am one of those children myself. And that's why I'm making these videos, because this is the story of my life transformation as well, and my perspective transformation. That self-correcting that I'm talking about exists within each one of us and is constantly growing in terms of like the expansiveness that can be reached by humanity in an overall polarized state. It constantly has to change itself to ideas of more community and group mentality. But that, if it's not done with complete integrity, which I mean holistic integration, complete holistic integration of nature and things that have nothing to do with political agendas or anything like that, if it's not done with all those things taken into account and made room for that to be what they naturally are, you get what happened with the Nazis. You get a totalitarian government, a regime that means to do the highest possible thing it can do for the highest reasons in society. But I mean, need I go further, right? It's absolutely destructive to like any kind of natural love-based expression that human beings can be in. And it's governed by a military state that creates lies in order to perpetuate its own like survival mechanism, which is basically running off of the entire creation of that expression and is ultimately self-contradicting, which is what I'm saying about the way the majority of human expressions of society or social interrelations actually exists. It's in such a state of like poverty to the soul that it is chewing itself into kind of like a negative self-destruction. And in that self-destruction, our species has come here to be born to rise from those ashes. My name is Summer. If you like these videos, please share, comment, like, subscribe. Please subscribe. Let me hear what you have to say in the comments, because I've said a lot in this video that could potentially ruffle feathers, but this is how I've come to learn to readjust my perspective in terms of what my nature, my physical body is telling me is actually in core and in principle actually accurate. So please let me know what you think. Have a great day.